In the Federation, you've got Moscow, you've got St. Petersburg, and then you have all these secondary cities that are dependent upon some degree of link to one of those two, and all of them have been conquered by Russia over the course of their existence. Every single one of them. Russia is not a republic. It's certainly not a democracy. It's a multi-ethnic empire. And with that sort of political and economic footing, someone's in charge. And if someone's not in charge, no one's in charge. And the future of Russia, in my opinion, is probably going towards the latter. But for now, it means that you have a strongman in the center who appoints regional strongmen like Kadyrov to look after things for him. This is not about growth. This is not about jobs. This is not about popularity. This is about control. Was smart because he turned one faction of the Chechens against the other Chechen factions, and together with the Russian military, they were able to break them all. And so that faction was rewarded with control over a personal fiefdom, very medieval, very Middle Ages, very feudalistic. Of course, as will always happen to fathers, they will pass on in time. Kadyrov Sr. was assassinated, and so Kadyrov Jr., the current guy, took over. And yes, this guy is dumb as a bag of snakes. There's no argument there. But he is proven relentlessly capable of keeping Chechnya in line. So Chechnya is no longer functionally part of the Russian Federation from an economic point of view, but the independence push was squelched. And Kadyrov regularly participates with Moscow when it comes to security issues. Specifically, Putin relies upon the Chechens to assassinate people in Russia who he finds politically. Oh, well, that's pre-Kadyrov. That was back in 2000. The theater situation, there were about 500 people who were in the theater. A bunch of Chechen terrorists, there's no other word, came in with explosives strapped to them. And because the Russians, let's just say that the emphasis that American hostage rescuers have on rescuing the hostages, that mindset doesn't really exist in Russia. So the Russian military just gassed the theater. And killed 3/4 of the hostages, and then went in with gas masks and shot everyone who had an explosive vest. Well, they had real weapons and they had real vests and they had killed real people before the gas was released. And from the Russian point of view, this was broadly a success. So I don't mean to suggest that there's a conspiracy there. Now, whether or not they were ready for it, that's fair.
Yeah.
The conspiracy theory that if you're going to pay attention when you should pay attention to is that back in 1999, a couple of apartment blocks in Moscow were blown up. No one in Chechnya claimed credit for it, and the Chechens had kind of screamed all of their bombings and successes from the rooftops for every other attack they'd ever done. But Putin blamed the Chechens for that and used that to whip up Russian public opinion into a frenzy and launch the Second Chechen War. So did Putin do it to his own people? Ukraine, even control of all of Ukraine doesn't solve the problem on the Western Front. They would, in addition, need Moldova, the northeastern sliver of Romania, that's part of the Bessarabian Gap, that's how the Turks have often invaded. They would also need eastern Poland right up into downtown Warsaw on the Vistula River. That's the Polish Gap. That's where the Nazis like to invade it. And then they would need Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in totality because that's how the Swedes have gotten in the past. So you're talking about 6 more countries, 5 which are members of NATO. Obviously, that's where things get very dicey. I mean, they can probably capture Moldova in a long weekend, although looking at the military effectiveness so far, maybe I should extend that out to a month.
Yeah, spring break at least.
Yeah. But for the other 5, if Ukraine is able to keep the fire lit, then the Russians aren't going to have enough conventional forces to do this. And the only thing worse than having a Russia that didn't try to do this and just kind of shrivels in time would be a Russia that leapt forward, launched the war, paid all the prices for the war, and still remains strategically unmoored. So there's a point we're going to get to in a few months, probably later this year, certainly next year, where the Russians will have digested Ukraine and Moldova to their satisfaction, their plan, and then they'll have that clash with NATO. And that's when the nukes become a very real question. They started moving in troops. It was apparent that the populations were Russified enough that they were not going to resist. And when talk in the West started coming around about, we're going to back dissident forces like, say, the Crimean Tatars, who are basically Turkish, the Russians snarled, well, that will mean an end to all energy and imports from the West energy exports from Russia into Europe. At which point, Angela Merkel, in one of her more ignoble moments, said, "No, Crimea is Russia's. We will have a level of sanctions that will not approach anything that causes economic pain to either side, and we are going to call it there." That is no longer an option. So strategic weapons are now on the table for that threat. Well, German and Russian history is always about trying to find ways to work together so they don't fight, and then that not working, so then they fight.
Right.
But then that doesn't work, so they try to find ways to work together so they don't fight. This is like the 9th cycle. That fails, so you go back. This is the back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and that's why the countries that are between the Russians and the Germans hate history so much. We've got a country of, well, at the start, it was a country of 45 million people.
Ukraine.
We're now down to Ukraine, yes. We're now down to 42.5 million people. It's the biggest movement of people ever recorded in human history. 2.5 million people in under 3 weeks. That's just unprecedented. And we are nowhere near done, because right now the fighting is only happening on less than 1/5 of Ukrainian territory.
Wow. Yeah, Ukraine is huge.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten to the part of Russia or of Ukraine that before 3 weeks ago we considered the pro-Western part. As a rule, it's not perfect, but the river, the Dnieper, that cuts the country roughly in half, the general understanding was if you're west of that, you're pro-Western and you consider yourself primarily Ukrainian, and if you're east of that, you're pro-Russian and you consider yourself at least a Russian speaker. What the Russians have done in the last 8 years and having this low-intensity war in Ukraine and the Donbass has changed that. And everyone in Ukraine is now broadly considering a Ukrainian. And outside of Russian TV, there's no one in Ukraine that is not resisting in some way. I mean, this is just an epic turnaround from a national identity point of view. So Russia is going to not just have to level the entire place, they're going to have to continually bomb and launch programs the length of the entire country to retain control. That's going to generate at least another 10 million refugees. And that's going to require at least a couple million Russian soldiers to occupy the place. And that's the vast bulk of the Russian military. That includes their draftees. So we're not just talking about the best Russian troops completely being locked up. We're talking about nearly all Russian troops being locked up, unless the Russians issue a state of emergency and start drafting anyone under age 50, which is probably where this is going to go, because the Russian economy is in free fall anyway. So why not?
That's just going to add
from
to
the
body
Russian
count.
point of view, this is about national survival.
Right.
And
right.
Can you imagine? I mean, there's no comparison in the American historical experience for something like this. When it comes to demographic collapse, it's never happened to a major power before. So, you know, the statistician in me is looking on at this fascination. It's like, okay, well, it's, you know, the only country with a worse demography than Russia is China. What happens there in a few years? Because that's not that far off. That's within a decade. But Russia is going to give us some interesting signposts that we can use to evaluate other countries that are in a similar demographic decline.